The Purple Gang, also known as the Sugar House Gang, was a criminal mob of bootleggers and hijackers composed of predominantly of Jewish gangsters. They operated in Detroit, Michigan during the 1920s of the Prohibition era and came to Detroit's dominant criminal gang. Excessive violence and infighting caused the gang to destroy itself in the 1930s. The Michigan legislature prohibited the sale of liquor in 1917, 3 years before national prohibition was established by a constitutional amendment. Along with temperance supporters, industrialist Henry Ford owned the River Rouge plant and desired a sober workforce, so he backed the Damon Act, a state law that, along with the Willie Act, prohibited virtually all possession, manufacture, or sale of alcohol starting in 1918. Detroit is close to Ohio, so bootleggers and others would import liquor from Toledo, where it was still legal. They also smuggled liquor in from Canada. Judges took a lenient views of offenders. The Damon Act was declared unconstitutional in 1919 by the state Supreme Court. In 1920, the Eighth Amendment was adopted and Prohibition took effect throughout the United States. Canada, particularly the port city of Windsor, Ontario, directly across the Detroit River from Detroit, became a major point for smuggling alcohol products into the U.S. The Canadian government had also banned the use of alcoholic beverages, but still approved the licensed distilleries and breweries to manufacture and export alcohol. To survive, some residents turned to crime, which they enforced with violence. The Hastings Street neighborhood in Detroit's Lower East Side was known as Paradise Valley. Most of the Purple Gang's core members went to Bishop School, where many had been placed in the division for problem children. The gang members were mostly American-born children of Jewish immigrants, primarily from Russia and Poland, who had come to the United States in the Great Immigration Wave from 1881 to 1914. The gang was led by brothers Abe, Joe, Raymond, and Izzy Bernstein, who had moved to Detroit from New York City. While in Detroit, casino operator Lincoln Fitzgerald was a gambler, and he became associated with the Detroit Purple Gang. In 1976, Fitzgerald opened a 16-story casino, which he named Fitzgerald's Casino and Hotel. At the time of his death, he was operating 3 casinos: Fitzgerald's Casino and Hotel in Reno, the Nevada Club in Reno, and the Nevada Lodge of Lake Tahoe. The Purple Gang started off as petty thieves and extortionists, but they quickly progressed to armed robbery and truck hijacking under the tutelage of older neighborhood gangsters. They gained notoriety for their operations and savagery, and they imported gangsters from other cities to work as muscle for the gang. It was known that in 1929, there were 25,000 illegal saloons in the Detroit city, so there was a large business for bootleggers, including the Purple Gang. The gang became hijackers and gained a reputation for stealing the alcohol cargoes of older and more established criminal gangs. The Purple Gang also employed gangs for raw labor and transport. For example, the Purple Gang enlisted the Little Jewish Navy to carry alcohol over the Detroit River from Canada before selling it themselves. Chicago gangster Al Capone was against expanding his rackets in Detroit, so he began a business accommodation with the Purple Gang in order to prevent a bloody war for several years. The gang managed the prosperous business of supplying Canadian whiskey to the Capone organization in Chicago. The Purple Gang was involved in various other criminal actions, such as kidnapping other gangsters for ransom, which became very popular during this era. The FBI suspected that they were involved with the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. By the late 1920s, the Purple Gang reigned supreme over the Detroit underworld, controlling the city's vice, gambling, liquor, and drug trade. They also ran the local wire service, providing horse racing information to local horse betting parlors. The gang members consorted with more infamous mobsters, branching into other cities as well. Ab Bernstein was a friend of Meyer Lansky and Joe Adonis, with whom he owned several Miami, Florida gambling casinos in his later years. The gang hijacked prize fight films and forced movie theaters to show them for a high fee. They also defrauded insurance companies by staging fake accidents. Altogether, the Purple Gang is alleged to have been responsible for 500 murders in the city. As the gang grew in size and influence, they began hiring themselves out as hitmen and took part in the cleaners and dryers war. The Purples profited from the Detroit laundry industry, unions and associations. They were hired to keep out union members in line and harass non-union independents. Bombing, arson, theft, and murder were the usual tactics that the gang employed to enforce union policy. The Detroit mob war soon ensued between the Italian, Irish, and Jewish bootleggers over territory. The Purples fought a vicious turf war with the Licavoli squad, led by the brothers Tommy and Pete Licavoli. In March 1927, 3 men were killed. The deceased men had been brought into Detroit as hired assassins for the Purple Gang, and the motive for the murder was believed to be retaliation for a double cross. The Purple Gang was suspected of taking part in the St. Valentines Day Massacre in Chicago. On February 13, 1929, A. Bernstein reputedly called Bugs Moran to tell him that a hijacked load of booze was on its way to Chicago. Moran, who was in the middle of a turf war with Capone, had only recently began to trust Bernstein, who had previously been Capone's chief supplier of Canadian liquor. The next day, instead of delivering a load of liquor, 4 men, 2 in police uniforms, went to SMC Cartage on North Clark Street, Moran's North Side hangout, and opened fire with a Thompson submachine gun, killing 7 men in what has become known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, with several witnesses and some items of physical evidence implicating Burke in the slayings. He was never charged. The Purple Gang began terrorizing Detroiters with the street executions of their enemies. Among their victims was city police officer Vivian Welsh, killed on February 1st, 1927. He was later revealed to be a dirty cop who was reputedly trying to extort money from the Purple Gang. Irving Milberg, Harry Kaywell, and Raymond Bernstein, 3 high-ranking Purples, were convicted of first-degree murder in the Collingwood Manor Massacre and were sentenced to life in prison. Bernstein, Milberg, and Kaywell were accompanied by police officers on a special Pullman train bound from Michigan's Upper Peninsula to begin serving their sentences in the state's maximum security prison in Marquette, Michigan. For many years, the Purples enjoyed seemingly complete immunity from police interference, as witnesses to crimes were terrified of testifying against any criminal identified as a purple gangster. They dressed flamboyantly, frequented the city's night spots, and were well known to the public. They lived in fine houses, and soon a romantic aura surrounding the Purples that distinguished them from the other gangs in Detroit. Jealousies, egos, and intra-gang quarrels would eventually cause the Purple Gang to collapse. The police eventually moved against them as gang members began leaving behind too much evidence of their crimes. The gang continued in a diminished capacity, but the predecessors of Detroit's modern-day Mafia stepped in and filled the void as the Purple Gangs ultimately self-destructed. Hit that like button, throw your thoughts and opinions in the comment section, hit the subscribe button. I'll catch you on the next one. Much love, peace, blessings, much gratitude.